Anny Mitchell was organizing inventory at her local veteran support center when the glass door burst open, shattering the peaceful morning silence. The thunderous roar of motorcycle engines cut through the air as three leather-clad bikers swaggered in, their boots scraping against the polished floor. Little did they know they were about to harass a former Navy SEAL who had spent 6 years conducting some of the military's most dangerous covert operations. The morning sun filtered through the center's large windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floors of the Veterans Assistance Office. Annie stood behind the main desk, her athletic frame concealed beneath a simple grey blazer and dark slacks. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, a habit she'd maintained since her military days. At 34, she carried herself with the quiet confidence that came from years of intensive training and real-world combat experience. The center was usually quiet at this hour, with only a handful of veterans seeking assistance with paperwork or attending their weekly support groups. Today, Annie had been meticulously organizing medical supply donations and updating the center's database, a task that required the same attention to detail she'd applied during her military career. Her fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard, logging each item with precision while simultaneously keeping an eye on the elderly veteran in the corner who was filling out benefit forms. The peace was shattered when the bikers entered, their leather vests adorned with patches declaring them members of the Steel Serpents. The leader, a tall man with a scraggly beard and serpent tattoo crawling up his neck, approached the desk with an exaggerated swagger. Behind him, his two companions spread out, their presence intentionally intimidating as they loomed over the seated veterans. "Well, well, what do we have here?" the leader drawled, leaning against the desk and deliberately knocking over a stack of carefully arranged forms. "Didn't know they let pretty little things run veteran centers nowadays." His breath reeked of stale cigarettes as he invaded Annie's personal space. Annie's jaw tightened, but her expression remained neutral. She'd faced worse situations in Baghdad and Kandahar, situations that made these wannabe tough guys look like playground bullies. Her green eyes, sharp and alert, took in every detail, the way the leader favored his right side, how the younger biker by the water cooler kept glancing nervously at the exit, the slight tremor in the third man's hands suggesting he was more bluster than actual threat. "The center opens at 9 for non-veterans," Annie stated calmly, her voice carrying the natural authority of someone used to commanding special operations teams. "If you're not here for assistance, I'll have to ask you to leave." She deliberately straightened the scattered papers, her movements measured and controlled. The leader, who would later introduce himself as Snake, let out a mocking laugh that echoed through the quiet space. "Assistance? Honey, this ain't no place for someone like you. These men," he gestured to the veterans in the room, "they need real help, not some secretary playing social worker." Annie noticed how the elderly veteran in the corner had tensed up, his weathered hands gripping his cane tighter. Two other vets near the coffee machine were watching the situation unfold, their postures rigid with concern. She knew they wanted to intervene, but she also knew this was her situation to handle. "This is your final warning," Annie said, her voice dropping to a quiet, dangerous tone that would have been immediately recognized by anyone who'd served in special operations. "Leave now, or things will get uncomfortable." She remained perfectly still, her breathing steady, her muscles coiled with the kind of readiness that came from years of close-quarters combat training. Snake's smirk widened as he interpreted her, calm demeanor as fear. He reached across the desk, intending to grab her arm. "Or what, sweetheart? You gonna call the cops on us? We're just having a friendly conversation here." The tension in the room was palpable. The morning sun continued to stream through the windows, casting harsh shadows across the scene about to unfold. Annie's mind flashed briefly to her last deployment, to the countless times she'd had to make split-second decisions in life or death situations. This wasn't life or death, but it was about to become a lesson in respecting veterans. All veterans, regardless of gender. The center's clock ticked steadily on the wall, marking the moments before everything would change. The bikers had no idea they were about to learn firsthand why the Navy SEALs were considered among the most lethal special operations forces in the world. And Anny Mitchell, who had spent years proving herself in a male-dominated field, was about to demonstrate why underestimating someone based on their appearance was always a dangerous mistake. The Veterans Assistance Center was a sanctuary, a place where those who had served could find support, understanding, and peace. The walls were adorned with service flags and framed photographs chronicling decades of military history. A large Marine Corps emblem hung prominently behind the main desk, its presence a silent guardian of the sacred space dedicated to helping those who had sacrificed for their country. Before the bikers' intrusion, the morning had started like any other. Vietnam veteran Frank Thompson had arrived early, his weathered hands clutching a folder of VA paperwork he needed help processing. A young Army specialist, James Rodriguez, sat in the corner, nursing a cup of coffee while waiting for his PTSD support group to begin. The smell of fresh coffee mingled with the subtle scent of old wood and paper, creating an atmosphere of comfort and familiarity. Annie had spent the last hour helping Frank navigate the complexities of his medical benefits application. Her patience and attention to detail had earned her the respect of the local veteran community, though few knew the full extent of her military background. She preferred to keep her service history private, letting her actions speak louder than her credentials. The center itself was housed in a renovated Victorian building, its high ceilings and large windows giving the space an open, welcoming feel. The main room was arranged with clusters of comfortable chairs and small tables, creating informal meeting areas where veterans could talk privately. A small kitchen area in the corner provided coffee and basic refreshments, while several private offices lined the back wall for confidential consultations. Through the windows, Annie could see Main Street coming to life. The small town of Cedar Ridge was just beginning its day, shop owners flipping their signs from closed to open, early morning joggers passing by, their breath visible in the crisp autumn air. It was the kind of peaceful scene that many veterans, including Annie, had fought to protect. The center's regular visitors had fallen into their usual morning routine. Dave Miller, a retired Air Force sergeant, was organizing the day's group therapy materials in the conference room. Rebecca Chen, another volunteer and Army veteran, was updating the bulletin board with new job postings and upcoming events. The quiet productivity of the morning painted a picture of recovery, support, and community. Annie had just finished helping Frank when she noticed a group of motorcycles pulling into the parking lot. Through the large front windows, she watched as 3 men dismounted their bikes, their leather vests marking them as members of a local motorcycle club. Something about their body language set off warning signals in her mind. The aggressive swagger, the territorial scanning of the building, the way they moved as a unit with clear, hostile intent. The elderly veterans in the room noticed too. Years of combat experience had honed their situational awareness, and Annie could see them subtly repositioning themselves, their bodies instinctively responding to potential threat. Frank gripped his cane tighter, while James straightened in his chair, his coffee forgotten. The center's security cameras tracked the bikers' approach, their feeds displaying on the small monitor partially hidden behind the front desk. Annie watched, their movement with the calculated precision of someone used to assessing tactical situations. The leader was clearly the one with the serpent tattoo, his body language broadcasting dominance and aggression. The youngest member seemed nervous, his movements less certain, while the third walked with a slight limp that could become tactically relevant if things escalated. Rebecca had moved closer to the front desk, her military training evident in her deliberate positioning, Without a word, she and Annie shared a look of understanding. They were prepared to protect their sanctuary if necessary. The center had dealt with difficult situations before, but usually involving veterans in crisis, not external threats looking to cause trouble. The morning light caught the polished wooden floors, creating long shadows that stretched across the room like reaching fingers. The American flag in the corner hung still, its presence a reminder of everything this place stood for: honor, sacrifice, and the brotherhood and sisterhood of those who had served. Annie took a deep breath, centering herself as she had done countless times before operations. Her mind quickly catalogued available resources: the panic button under the desk, the security cameras recording everything, the police station just 3 blocks away. But she also knew that involving law enforcement would be a last resort. This was a veteran space, and she preferred to handle problems internally when possible. The clock on the wall marked 8:47 a.m. as the bikers approached the entrance. Through the glass doors, their shadows loomed larger than life, a deliberate intimidation tactic that Annie had seen employed in various forms across multiple continents. The center's peaceful morning was about to be disrupted, but Anny Mitchell had faced far worse odds in places far more dangerous than this. As she straightened the papers on her desk, her muscle memory from years of combat training remained sharp, ready to respond to whatever situation was about to unfold. Snake leaned further across the desk, his leather jacket creaking as he moved. "You know what I think?" he sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "I think this place needs some real leadership, someone who understands what these men have been through, not some prissy little office girl playing soldier." The other 2 bikers spread out, positioning themselves strategically around the room. The younger one, who couldn't have been more than 25, knocked over a stack of veteran support pamphlets with a deliberate sweep of his arm. The third biker, sporting a graying beard and a faded steel Serpents patch, positioned himself near the exit, effectively blocking the main escape route. "Tell you what, sweetheart," Snake continued, reaching out to touch Annie's name tag, "why don't you go fetch us some coffee while we have a chat with the real veterans here?" His fingers were inches from her blazer when Annie's hand moved, lightning fast, catching his wrist in a grip that made his eyes widen with surprise. "First," Annie said, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had commanded special operations teams in the dead of night, "you don't touch me. Second, this center opens at 9 for non-veterans. Third," she released his wrist with a controlled precision that spoke volumes, "I've earned my place here just like everyone else." Snake rubbed his wrist, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face before being replaced by anger. "Earned your place?" he scoffed, but there was a new edge to his voice. "What, by answering phones and filling out paperwork? These men," he gestured to the veterans watching the scene unfold, "they've seen real combat. They've bled for their country." The younger biker, emboldened by his leader's words, kicked over a chair. "Yeah, what would you know about combat?" he taunted, his voice cracking slightly with nervous energy. "Bet you've never even held a weapon." Annie remained perfectly still, her posture relaxed but ready. Her eyes tracked every movement in the room, just as they had during countless missions. She noted how Frank had quietly pressed the panic button under his table, how James had moved to protect the more elderly veterans, how Rebecca had positioned herself near the fire extinguisher, a potential improvised weapon if needed. "I suggest," Annie said, each word measured and precise, "that you rethink your assumptions about who I am and what I'm capable of." Her green eyes locked onto Snake's, and for a moment, something in her gaze made him take an involuntary step back. It was the look of someone who had faced death and dealt it in equal measure. The third biker, watching from his position by the door, shifted uncomfortably. "Snake," he muttered, "maybe we should—" "Shut up, Diesel," Snake snapped, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. He turned back to Annie, attempting to reassert his dominance. "Look, lady, we're just making sure this place is being Run right. These vets deserve better than some pencil-pushing princess. Annie's lip curved slightly, not quite a smile. You know what these veterans deserve? She asked, her voice carrying across the now silent room. They deserve respect. They deserve a safe place to heal. And they deserve better than watching three wannabe tough guys disrespect their sanctuary. The younger biker laughed, but it was a hollow sound. What are you going to do about it? Call the cops? I don't need to call anyone, Annie replied, her calm demeanor somehow more threatening than any show of anger. I've handled worse situations than this in places a lot more dangerous than Cedar Ridge. Snake's face darkened with rage. Is that a threat? He demanded, taking an aggressive step forward. You think you can intimidate us? We're the Steel Serpents, sweetheart. We don't back down from anyone. Annie didn't move, but something shifted. In her stance, a subtle change that every combat veteran in the room recognized. It was the coiled readiness of a predator, the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly how many ways they could end a confrontation. That's your choice, she said softly. But before you make it, you might want to ask yourself why none of the veterans in this room are impressed by your display. She gestured to the watching men and women, their faces showing not fear, but quiet anticipation. They know the difference between real warriors and people playing dress-up. The tension in the room crackled like electricity before a storm. Snake's fingers curled into fists, his knuckles whitening with pressure. The younger biker had stopped his destructive wandering, suddenly unsure of his role in the escalating situation. Diesel, by the door, was openly nervous now, his eyes darting between Annie and his leader. Through the windows, the morning sun cast harsh shadows across the scene, highlighting the stark contrast between the biker's aggressive posturing and Annie's controlled composure. The center's clock ticked steadily, marking the moments before someone would make a decision that would change the course of this confrontation. Annie watched as Snake's aggression reached its boiling point, his face reddening with each passing second. Her mind, sharpened by years of special operations training, had already mapped out 14 different ways this confrontation could unfold. None of them ended well for the bikers. "You've got some nerve," Snake snarled, slamming his fist on the desk. The sound echoed through the center like a gunshot, causing several veterans to flinch. "Standing there acting all high and mighty, what makes you think you can talk to us like that?" Annie remained motionless, her breathing steady and controlled. 6 years of conducting covert operations had taught her that true power lay in restraint, not in dramatic displays of force. "I'm not acting," she replied, her voice carrying the weight of countless missions. "I'm giving you a chance to walk away with your dignity intact." The younger biker, who'd been circling the room, knocked over another chair. "You hear that, Snake? She's giving us a chance." His laugh was sharp and nervous, betraying his growing unease. "Maybe she'll write us up a detention slip while she's at it." Frank Thompson, the elderly Vietnam veteran, spoke up from his corner. "Son," he said, his weathered voice carrying decades of combat experience, "you might want to reconsider your position here." His eyes met Annie's with knowing respect. "Some storms are better left unprovoked." Snake spun toward Frank, jabbing a finger in his direction. "Stay out of this, old man. This is between us and Little Miss Perfect here." He turned back to Annie, leaning across the desk until his face was inches from hers. "You think because you work in this place, you understand what these men have been through, the hell they've seen." Annie's green eyes hardened, reflecting memories of midnight raids and underwater infiltrations. "I understand more than you think," she said quietly. "I understand the weight of decisions that cost lives. I understand the silence after an explosion. I understand what it means to carry your wounded brother through enemy territory." Something in her tone made Snake hesitate, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. but his pride wouldn't let him back down now, not in front of his crew. "Big words from someone pushing papers," he sneered, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. The center had grown completely still, the morning sun casting long shadows across the polished floor. Rebecca had moved closer to the elderly veterans, her own military training evident in her protective stance. James Rodriguez, the young army specialist, watched the scene with growing recognition in his eyes. "You want to know what I think?" Snake continued, desperately trying to maintain control of the situation. "I think you're just another civilian playing dress-up. Wearing a blazer and acting tough doesn't make you one of us." Annie's lip curved slightly, not in amusement but in recognition of the irony. "Interesting choice of words," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded elite teams through hostile territories. "Speaking of dress-up, that patch on your vest, steel serpents. When did you earn that?" The question caught Snake off guard. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Well," Annie continued, her tone conversational but laden with purpose, "in my experience, those who've earned their insignias understand respect. They understand that true strength isn't about intimidation. They certainly understand not to harass veterans in their own sanctuary." Diesel, still by the door, shifted uncomfortably. "Snake, maybe we should—" "Shut up!" Snake snapped, but his voice cracked slightly. He turned back to Annie, his anger tinged with growing uncertainty. "You don't know anything about us!" "I know you're compensating," Annie replied calmly. "I know your aggressive display is masking insecurity. And I know," she added, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "that you're about to make a serious mistake if you don't walk away." The younger biker had stopped his destructive wandering, sensing the shift in the room's atmosphere. The veterans watching the scene unfold had begun to exchange knowing looks, recognizing something in Annie's demeanor that the bikers had missed. Snake's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white with tension. "Is that a threat?" he demanded, though his voice had lost its earlier swagger. "You threatening us?" "No," Annie replied, her stance shifting almost imperceptibly. "I'm giving you information. What you do with it is your choice. But remember," she added, her eyes reflecting years of combat experience, "you chose to come in here. You chose to disrespect this place, and you're choosing what happens next." The morning light streamed through the windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air between Annie and the increasingly uncertain bikers. The clock on the wall continued its steady rhythm, marking the moments before someone would make a decision that would change the course of this confrontation. The tension in the room had reached its peak, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Annie stood perfectly still, her military training evident in her economy of movement, while Snake struggled with the growing realization that he might have severely underestimated his opponent. Snake's facade cracked further as he processed Annie's words, his bravado wavering in the face of her unwavering composure. He took a half-step back, then caught himself, aware that his crew was watching. His attempt to reassert dominance came out forced and hollow. "You think you're so special?" he growled, but his voice had lost its earlier conviction. "Standing there in your fancy clothes, acting like you know something about sacrifice." He gestured wildly around the room. "These men, they've seen things you couldn't imagine in your worst nightmares." Annie's eyes never left Snake's face, but her peripheral vision tracked every movement in the room. The younger biker had drifted closer to his leader, seeking reassurance. Diesel remained by the door, his discomfort now plainly visible. The veterans in the room had grown completely still, recognizing the signs of an imminent confrontation. "Nightmares," Annie repeated softly, memories of classified operations flickering behind her eyes. "Let me tell you about nightmares, Snake. Nightmares are watching your teammate bleed out in a country that doesn't officially exist. Nightmares are making decisions. That means some people come home and others don't. Nightmares, her voice dropped lower, are the sounds of combat that never quite leave your head. The atmosphere in the room shifted perceptibly. James Rodriguez, the young army specialist, straightened in his chair, recognition dawning on his face. He'd heard rumors about female operators in special operations, though they were rarely discussed openly. Snake's expression flickered between anger and uncertainty. "You're lying," he said, but doubt had crept into his voice. "You're just trying to—" "I'm not trying to do anything," Annie cut him off, her tone carrying the authority of someone used to commanding elite teams. "I'm telling you how things are. This center is a sanctuary for veterans, all veterans, and you're disrespecting everything it stands for." The younger biker, sensing the shift in power dynamics, tried to salvage their intimidation attempt. "Come on, Snake, she's just a woman. We can't let her—" "Just a woman," Frank Thompson's voice carried across the room, heavy with experience. "Son, do you know how many women have served, have died, have led men into combat?" The Vietnam veteran's eyes never left Annie's face. "Some of the toughest soldiers I've known wore their hair in a bun." Snake's composure continued to crack. He glanced around the room, suddenly aware that none of the veterans present seemed concerned for Annie's safety. If anything, they appeared to be watching him with a mixture of pity and anticipation. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, trying to maintain his aggressive stance. "You expect us to believe you're some kind of soldier in that outfit?" Annie's lip curved slightly. "You know what's ridiculous? Judging someone's capabilities by their appearance, making assumptions about who can and can't serve, thinking that your leather vest and attitude make you somehow superior to the people in this room." The morning sun had climbed higher, its rays now streaming directly through the windows, casting harsh shadows across Snake's increasingly uncertain face. The center's clock ticked steadily, marking each moment of his crumbling authority. "I've seen real combat," Snake insisted, but his voice had lost its edge. "I've been in fights you wouldn't believe." "Bar fights don't count as combat experience," Annie replied evenly. "And terrorizing civilians doesn't make you tough, it makes you a bully." The younger biker shifted nervously, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. "Snake, maybe we should just—" "Shut up!" Snake snapped, but the command lacked conviction. He turned back to Annie, desperately trying to regain control of the situation. "You think you can stand there and lecture us? You don't know what we're capable of." Annie's stance shifted slightly, a movement so subtle that only the combat veterans in the room recognized it for what it was, the coiled readiness of someone prepared for anything. "Actually," she said quietly, "I know exactly what you're capable of, and more importantly, I know what I'm capable of." The tension in the room reached a critical point. Even the dust motes in the sunbeams seemed to freeze, waiting for the next move. Snake's hands clenched and unclenched, his internal struggle visible on his face. The respect he demanded was slipping away with each passing second, replaced by a growing realization that he'd walked into something he didn't understand. Rebecca had moved closer to the desk, her own military training evident in her positioning. The veterans in the room remained still, but alert, many of them recognizing in Annie's demeanor something they'd seen in their own special operations teammates. The quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly how many ways you could end a confrontation. The clock's steady ticking seemed to grow louder in the silence, counting down to the moment when someone would have to make a decision. The sanctuary of the Veterans Center hung in the balance, its peace threatened by pride and misunderstanding. "You've got one last chance," Snake snarled, his voice rising with desperate bravado. "One last chance to show some respect before things get ugly." He straightened to his full height, attempting to loom over the desk that separated them. But Annie noticed how his weight shifted backward, betraying his growing uncertainty. The younger biker, trying to support his leader, kicked another chair. The sound echoed through the center like a gunshot, causing several veterans to tense. "Yeah," he called out, his voice cracking slightly. "Things are about to get real ugly." Annie remained motionless, her breathing steady and controlled. Years of special operations had taught her to read situations like this, to spot the telltale signs of impending violence. Snake's right hand kept twitching toward his pocket. His left foot was positioned for a quick pivot, and his eyes darted repeatedly to the exit, all signs of someone preparing for either fight or flight. "I've seen ugly," Annie replied, her voice carrying the weight of countless classified missions. "I've seen it in places you can't find on a map, during operations that never officially happened. Trust me," her eyes locked onto Snake's. "You don't want to see my version of ugly." The atmosphere in the center grew thick with tension. Frank Thompson had quietly wheeled his chair away from the potential conflict zone, but his eyes never left the scene. James Rodriguez had positioned himself near the elderly veterans, ready to protect them if necessary. Rebecca maintained her strategic position, her military training evident in every controlled movement. Snake's facade cracked further, uncertainty bleeding through his aggressive posture. "You think you're tough because you work here?" he spat, but his voice trembled slightly. "Because these old-timers treat you like one of them?" "No," Annie answered calmly. "I know I'm tough because I've earned it. Buddhist training tends to do that to a person." She let that sink in, watching as confusion crossed Snake's face. "That's basic underwater demolition SEAL training, in case you're wondering." The younger biker's nervous energy faltered. "SEAL? What's she talking about, Snake?" Diesel, still by the door, shifted uncomfortably. "Snake," he muttered. "I've heard about female operators in special forces. Maybe we should—" "Shut up," Snake snapped, but his voice had lost its commanding edge. He turned back to Annie, desperation creeping into his expression. "You're lying. There's no way you're a Navy SEAL," Annie finished for him. "Would you like to test that theory?" Her stance shifted almost imperceptibly, but every combat veteran in the room recognized the change. It was the subtle adjustment of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of close-quarters combat. The morning sun cast harsh shadows across Snake's increasingly pale face. Sweat had begun to bead on his forehead, despite the room's comfortable temperature. The serpent tattoo on his neck seemed to writhe with each nervous swallow. "Look," he said, trying to maintain his threatening demeanor. "We're just making sure this place is being run right. These vets deserve respect," Annie cut him off, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded elite teams through hostile territory. "They deserve to feel safe in their own sanctuary, and they deserve better than watching three wannabe tough guys try to compensate for their insecurities." The younger biker had stopped his destructive pacing, now hovering uncertainly near the water cooler. The veterans in the room watched with knowing expressions, some even allowing small smiles to cross their weathered faces. "You can't talk to us like that," Snake protested, but his words rang hollow. "We're the Steel Serpents. We don't back down." From anyone." Annie's expression remained neutral, but her eyes hardened. "You're not serpents," she said quietly. "You're not even garden snakes. You're just three men who've made a series of increasingly poor decisions. And right now, you're about to make another one unless you turn around and walk out that door." The clock on the wall seemed to tick louder in the tense silence. Through the windows, the morning sun highlighted the dust motes dancing in the air, between Annie and the increasingly uncertain bikers. The moment stretched, heavy with potential energy, like the silence before a thunderstorm. Snake's right hand twitched toward his pocket again, and Annie's muscles coiled imperceptibly tighter. She had already calculated 14 different ways to neutralize him before he could reach whatever he was carrying, each scenario ending with minimal collateral damage to the center's property. The younger biker's nervous energy had completely evaporated, replaced by a growing realization that they had severely miscalculated their situation. Diesel's discomfort by the door had evolved into obvious anxiety, his eyes darting between his leader and the exit with increasing frequency. The tension in the room reached its peak, the air practically crackling with potential energy. Annie stood, perfectly still, her military training evident in her economy of movement, while Snake struggled with the growing realization that he had walked into something far beyond his understanding. Snake's hand finally made its move, reaching for his pocket in a desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. But before his fingers could close around whatever he was carrying, Annie's voice cut through the air like a steel blade. "I wouldn't," she said softly, her tone carrying the kind of authority that had once guided teams through enemy territory. "Your hand is trembling, your stance is compromised, and you're telegraphing your intentions like a rookie. Whatever you're reaching for, it's not worth what happens next." Snake's hand froze midway to his pocket. The morning sun caught the sweat beading on his forehead, making it glisten. His eyes, previously filled with arrogance, now showed the first real traces of fear. "You don't know what I'm capable of," he growled, but his voice had lost its earlier swagger. His eyes darted to his crew members, seeking support that was rapidly evaporating. Annie's lip curved slightly, not in amusement, but in recognition. "Actually, I do. Your body language tells me everything. The way you shift your weight, the angle of your shoulders, the tension in your jaw. I've spent years reading people like you in situations far more dangerous than this." The younger biker had backed away from the confrontation, his earlier bravado completely dissolved. "Snake," he muttered, "maybe we should listen to her. Something's not right here." Frank Thompson, the Vietnam veteran, spoke up from his corner. "Son," he addressed Snake, his voice heavy with experience, "I've seen that look before, in the jungle, in the eyes of operators who could end a fight before it began. You're out of your depth here." Snake's face contorted with a mix of anger and uncertainty. "You expect me to believe she's some kind of elite operator? Look at her!" But his voice cracked on the last word, betraying his growing doubt. Annie remained perfectly still, her posture relaxed yet ready. "You know what the first thing they teach you in Bud-S is?" she asked conversationally. "It's not about strength, it's not about speed, it's about mindset. The ability to stay calm when everything around you is chaos." The center had grown completely silent. Even the usual morning traffic outside seemed muted, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The veterans in the room watched with knowing expressions, recognizing the controlled power in Annie's stance. "During Hell Week," Annie continued, her voice steady, "they push you past every limit you thought you had. You learn to function on no sleep, to perform under extreme stress, to make critical decisions when your body is screaming at you to quit. But most importantly," her eyes locked onto Snake's, "you learn to recognize threats, real threats." Snake's hand had dropped away from his pocket, his aggressive posture deflating with each word. The serpent tattoo on his neck seemed to writhe with his nervous swallowing. "Right now," Annie said, her voice dropping lower, "you're not a threat. You're a distraction. A disruption to the peace of this center, and I've dealt with far worse distractions in places a lot more hostile than this." Rebecca had moved closer to the desk, her own military training evident in her positioning. The other veterans in the room remained still but alert, many of them recognizing in Annie's demeanor something they'd seen in their own special operations teammates. "You think your vest and your attitude make you dangerous?" Annie continued, each word measured and precise. "I've worked with real operators, men and women who could end a confrontation in seconds, but chose not to because they understood the value of restraint. People who earned their insignias through blood and sacrifice, not by intimidating civilians." The younger biker had completely abandoned his attempt at looking tough, now hovering near the exit. Diesel's discomfort had evolved into obvious anxiety, his eyes fixed on Annie with growing recognition. "We're the steel serpents," Snake protested, but the word sounded hollow even to his own ears. "We don't back down from anyone." "No," Annie corrected him quietly. "You're three men who made a mistake. You walked into a veterans center thinking you could throw your weight around. You disrespected a place of healing. And now," her voice hardened slightly, "you're going to make a choice. Walk out that door with whatever dignity you have left, or find out firsthand why Navy SEALs are considered among the most lethal special operations forces in the world." The clock ticked steadily on the wall, marking the moments as Snake's bravado crumbled. The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished floor, highlighting the stark contrast between Annie's controlled composure and the biker's increasing uncertainty. The power shift in the room was palpable. What had started as an attempt at intimidation had transformed into a lesson in real authority, the kind that came not from aggressive displays, but from years of proven capability and absolute control. Snake's composure finally shattered like glass hitting concrete. His hands, which had been clenched into fists, slowly uncurled as the full reality of his situation sank in. The morning sun streaming through the windows highlighted the beads of sweat, now rolling down his temples, his serpent tattoo glistening with nervous perspiration. "You're really he started, then stopped, his voice trailing off as he struggled to process the revelation. "But you don't look like a Navy SEAL," Annie finished for him, her voice carrying a hint of tired amusement. "Tell me, Snake, what exactly does a Navy SEAL look like? Because I've served with operators of every size, shape, and background. The only thing they had in common was their unwavering commitment to the mission." The younger biker had completely abandoned his attempt at intimidation, now hovering near the exit like a moth seeking escape. "Snake," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "My cousin told me about female operators in special forces, said they were some of the most dangerous—" "Shut up, Tommy," Snake snapped, but his voice cracked, the command carrying none of its earlier authority. His eyes darted around the room, taking in the knowing looks from the veterans present, the quiet confidence in Annie's stance, the obvious shift in power dynamics. Annie took a single step forward, her movement so controlled, it made Snake involuntarily step back. "Let me paint you a picture," she said, her voice low and steady. "Before running this center, I spent 6 years conducting operations you'll never read about in places you can't find on a map. I've swum through waters so cold it felt like thousands of knives cutting into my skin. I've waited in complete stillness for hours, sometimes days, for the perfect moment to strike." The center had grown completely silent. Even the usual morning traffic outside seemed muted. Every veteran in the room recognized the truth in her words, the weight of experience behind them. "But you know what's really interesting?" Annie continued, her green eyes locked onto Snake's increasingly uncertain gaze. "None of that matters right now. What matters is that you came into this sanctuary, this place of healing, thinking you could throw your weight around. You thought you could intimidate someone just because they didn't fit your narrow view of what strength looks like." Frank Thompson wheeled his chair closer, his weathered face showing a mixture of respect and satisfaction. "In Nam," he said, his voice carrying decades of experience, "we learned quick not to judge operators by how they looked. Some of the deadliest folks I ever met could walk into a room and nobody would look twice at them." Snake's bravado had completely evaporated, replaced by a dawning realization of just how badly he had miscalculated. His leather vest, adorned with patches meant to intimidate, suddenly seemed costume-like, a cheap imitation of real authority. "We didn't know," he managed, taking another step back. "We just thought—" "You thought wrong," Annie cut him off, her voice firm but not unkind. And now you have a choice to make. You can walk out that door, think about your actions, and maybe learn something from this experience. Or her tone dropped slightly, carrying the weight of countless combat operations. You can continue down this path and find out exactly what 6 years of special operations training looks like up close. The younger biker, Tommy, was already backing toward the exit. "Snake man, let's just go. This isn't what we thought it was." Diesel, who had maintained his position by the door throughout the confrontation, finally spoke up. "She's right, Snake. We're in over our heads here. I've heard stories about SEAL operators. They're not people you want to mess with." The morning sun had climbed higher, its rays now directly illuminating Annie's face. In the harsh light, Snake could finally see what he had missed before, the subtle scars near her hairline, the way her eyes constantly tracked movement in the room, the absolute certainty in her stance that came only from years of combat experience. "This center," Annie said, her voice softening slightly, "exists to help veterans heal, to give them a safe place where they can process their experiences and find their way forward. Every person in this room has sacrificed something for their country. They deserve better than this kind of display." The clock on the wall continued its steady rhythm, marking the moments as Snake's worldview shifted. The other veterans in the room watched silently, many of them wearing small smiles of satisfaction as they witnessed the transformation from arrogant bully to humbled observer. Snake started, then stopped, seeming to struggle with the words, his shoulders slumped, the aggressive posture completely gone. "I'm sorry," he finally managed, the words coming out barely above a whisper. Annie's expression remained neutral, but there was a hint of approval in her eyes. "Don't apologize to me," she said quietly. "Apologize to every veteran in this room whose sanctuary you disrupted. Then take your crew and leave. And remember this feeling the next time you think about judging someone based on appearances." Snake turned slowly, his movements uncertain as he faced the veterans in the room. His leather vest seemed to weigh heavily on his shoulders now, each patch and decoration a reminder of his misplaced arrogance. The morning sunlight cast harsh shadows across his face, highlighting the struggle playing out in his expression. He began, his voice hoarse. "I apologize to all of you. We had no right to come in here and disrespect this place." His eyes moved from face to face, taking in the quiet dignity of each veteran present. "We were wrong. About everything." Frank Thompson wheeled his chair forward slightly, his weathered hands resting on the armrests. "Apology accepted, son," he said, his voice carrying the wisdom of years. "But make sure you learn from this. Real strength isn't about intimidation. It's about knowing when to stand down and admit you were wrong." The younger biker, Tommy, stepped forward nervously. "I'm sorry too," he added, his earlier bravado completely gone. "My grandfather was a veteran. He'd be ashamed of how I acted today." Annie watched the scene unfold, her posture still alert but slightly relaxed. Years of special operations had taught her to read people, to recognize genuine remorse from tactical retreat. The shame in Snake's voice, the way his shoulders had lost their aggressive set, the genuine distress in his eyes, all pointed to a real moment of realization. "Sometimes," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded elite teams, "the bravest thing you can do is acknowledge your mistakes and work to correct them." Diesel nodded from his position near the door. "She's right, Snake," he said, his voice carrying a new note of respect. "We came in here thinking we were something we're not, made fools of ourselves in front of real warriors." The morning sun continued to stream through the windows, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air. The center's clock ticked steadily, marking this moment of transformation. The other veterans in the room watched silently, many of them having seen similar scenes play out before, moments when bravado crumbled in the face of genuine strength. Snake's hand moved to his vest, fingers tracing the steel Serpents patch. "We thought we were tough," he said, more to himself than anyone else. thought we could push people around, make them respect us. But this, he gestured around the room, this is real respect. Earned respect, Annie's expression softened slightly. Respect isn't taken, Snake, it's earned. Every veteran in this room earned it through sacrifice, through service, through putting something larger than themselves first. James Rodriguez, the young army specialist, spoke up from his corner. It's not too late to change, you know, to be better than this. The tension in the room had transformed into something different now. Not the crackling energy of impending conflict, but the quiet intensity of a moment of truth. Snake's crew stood quietly, their earlier attempts at intimidation forgotten. As they processed the full weight of their actions, "We should go," Snake said finally, his voice heavy with realization. He turned back to Annie, struggling to meet her steady gaze. We won't bother this place again. You have my word." Annie nodded slightly, recognizing the sincerity in his voice. "Make sure you keep that word," she replied, her tone firm but not unkind. "This center is important to a lot of people. It needs to remain a safe space." Tommy and Diesel had already started moving toward the exit, their movements careful and respectful now. Snake took one last look around the room, his eyes lingering on the military flags and service photos that adorned the walls. In the harsh morning light, they seemed to carry new meaning for him. "I never thought—" he started, then stopped, shaking his head. "I never thought someone like you could be what you are." "That's the problem with assumptions," Annie replied quietly. "They blind us to reality. Every person in this room has a story, has sacrificed something for their country. Some of us carry visible scars, others don't, but we all earned our place here." The clock continued its steady rhythm as Snake turned toward the door, his shoulders slumped in a posture of genuine humility. The other veterans watched his retreat, their expressions a mixture of satisfaction and understanding. They had seen this before, the moment when false bravado confronted real strength and crumbled. Rebecca moved to stand beside Annie, her own military bearing evident in her stance. "Think they learned something today?" she asked quietly. Annie's eyes remained on the retreating bikers, years of tactical assessment evident in her gaze. "They learned something," she replied softly. "Whether it sticks or not, that's up to them." The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished floor as the bikers made their way to the exit, their leather vests no longer symbols of intimidation, but reminders of their misplaced pride. The center's peaceful atmosphere began to return, the tension dissolving like morning mist in the sunlight. Snake paused at the threshold, his hand resting on the door handle. The morning sun caught the silver rings on his fingers, making them gleam as they trembled slightly. He turned back one last time, his face a canvas of conflicting emotions, shame, respect, and lingering disbelief, all warring for dominance. "You... No," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "All my life I've tried to be tough. Thought it was about making others fear you, about being the biggest and loudest in the room." His eyes met Annie's, finding nothing but calm understanding in her steady gaze. "But you showed me what real strength looks like." Annie stood motionless behind her desk, her posture relaxed but alert, a habit ingrained by years of special operations. "Real strength," she replied quietly, "is about protection, not intimidation. It's about standing up for others, not pushing them down." Tommy and Diesel hovered near their leader, their earlier bravado completely forgotten. The younger biker, Tommy, kept glancing at Annie with a mixture of awe and embarrassment. "My cousin," he said hesitantly, "he told me stories about special forces operators. Said they were like ghosts, could end a fight before it began. I didn't believe him then." "Believe it now?" Frank called from his corner, a knowing smile crinkling his weathered face. The Vietnam veteran wheeled his chair forward slightly. Son, in all my years of service, I learned one thing. The truly dangerous ones never need to prove anything. Snake's fingers tightened on the door handle, his knuckles whitening with pressure. We've been doing it all wrong, he admitted. More to himself than anyone else. The steel serpents. We thought we were building something tough, something people would respect. But this, he gestured around the center, this is real respect. Annie's expression remained neutral, but her voice carried a note of understanding. It's never too late to change course, she said, to become something better than what you are. Every veteran in this room has had to reinvent themselves at some point. The morning light streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. The center's clock continued its steady rhythm, marking this moment of transformation. The other veterans watched silently, many of them having witnessed similar moments of realization throughout their service years. I don't even know how to begin, Snake muttered, his earlier confidence replaced by genuine uncertainty. How to be different? Rebecca stepped forward, her own military bearing evident in her movement. You begin by remembering this moment, she said firmly, by remembering what real strength looks like, and choosing to work toward that instead of what you've been doing. The younger biker, Tommy, nodded eagerly. Maybe we could, if it's allowed, maybe we could help around here sometimes, make up for what we did. Annie's lip curved slightly, not quite a smile, but an acknowledgement of the genuine change in their demeanor. The center's always open to those who want to contribute positively, she said, but it has to be for the right reasons. Not for show, not for reputation, but because you genuinely want to help. Snake straightened slightly, some of his old confidence returning, but different now, tempered by humility. We'll earn it, he said quietly. Whatever it takes. We'll show you we can be better than this. The tension in the room had completely transformed. The earlier threat of violence replaced by something more profound, the quiet energy of potential redemption. The other veterans in the room exchanged knowing looks, many of them having witnessed similar transformations during their service years. Remember this feeling, Annie advised, her voice carrying the weight of experience. Remember what it's like to stand in this room, surrounded by people who've sacrificed everything for something bigger than themselves. Let that guide your actions moving forward. Snake nodded slowly, his eyes taking in the military flags, the service photos, the quiet dignity of the space he had so carelessly disrupted. We will, he promised, his voice steady for the first time since realizing his mistake. You have. My word is, well, just my word, for whatever that's worth now. Sometimes, Annie replied, a man's word is all he has. Make it count. The morning sun had climbed higher, its rays now falling directly across the threshold where the bikers stood. Beyond the glass doors, their motorcycles gleamed in the parking lot, symbols of their old life waiting at the crossroads of change. Thank you, Snake said finally, the words coming out rough but sincere, for showing us, for teaching us. He trailed off, unable to fully articulate the transformation he had undergone in the space of one morning. Annie nodded once, a gesture that carried both acknowledgement and dismissal. The bikers turned to leave, their leather vests no longer worn with aggressive pride, but with the weight of newfound understanding. As they stepped into the morning sunlight, their shadows stretched long across the parking lot, marking the path of their departure and perhaps their redemption. The sound of motorcycles starting up filled the morning air, then gradually faded as the bikers rode away from the Veterans Center. Annie watched through the window until they disappeared around the corner, her trained eyes tracking their departure with the same attention to detail that had kept her alive during countless missions. Frank Thompson wheeled himself closer to Annie's desk, his weathered hands folded in his lap. You handled that perfectly, he said quietly. His voice, carrying decades of combat experience, gave them a chance to learn without breaking them. That's the mark of a true operator. Annie turned from the window, her shoulders relaxing slightly, now that the immediate situation had been resolved. Sometimes the hardest battles are the ones we choose not to fight, she replied, memories of her SEAL training flickering behind her eyes. Bud S. taught us that force isn't always the answer. The center gradually began returning to its normal rhythm. James Rodriguez resumed his position in the corner with his coffee, though his eyes now held a new respect when they glanced at Annie. Rebecca started picking up the scattered pamphlets and righting the overturned chairs, restoring order to their sanctuary. "You know," James said, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled over the room, "I've served with special forces operators before, but I never knew there were female SEALs. Must have been quite a journey." Annie's expression remained neutral, but her voice carried a hint of pride. "It wasn't easy," she admitted, straightening the papers on her desk with military precision. "The standards weren't lowered. The expectations weren't changed. You either made it or you didn't. Gender wasn't a factor." Frank nodded knowingly, his eyes distant with memories. "Reminds me of something my commanding officer used to say in Vietnam," he mused. "Said the enemy doesn't care who you are, only what you can do. Guess that applies to training too." The morning sun had reached its full strength now, bathing the center in warm light that highlighted the military flags and service photos on the walls. Each image told a story of sacrifice, of dedication, of pushing beyond perceived limitations. "Those bikers," Rebecca said, placing the last chair back in position. "Do you think they really learned something today? Or will they be back to their old ways by sunset?" Annie considered the question, her tactical mind analyzing the situation as she had done countless times in the field. "They learned something," she said finally. "Whether it stays with them depends on what they choose to do with that knowledge. Sometimes the hardest part of change is maintaining it." James stood up, walking to the coffee machine to pour a fresh cup. "You know what impressed me most?" he said, his voice carrying admiration. "Not just that you could have taken them down in seconds, but that you chose not to. That's real control." "In special operations," Annie replied, her voice taking on the tone she had used when training new team members, "we learned that the best victories are often the ones where no shots are fired. Sometimes showing someone a better path is more effective than forcing them down it." The center's clock ticked steadily on the wall, marking the passage of time in this place of healing and transformation. Through the windows, the normal activities of Cedar Ridge continued. People walking their dogs, shop owners sweeping their sidewalks, life moving forward as it always did. "Still," Frank said with a slight smile, "would have been something to see you in action. Bet those boys had no idea what they were walking into." Annie's lip curved slightly as she remembered the look on Snake's face when he finally understood who he was dealing with. "The element of surprise has always been one of our greatest advantages," she said. "People see what they expect to see, until suddenly they don't." Rebecca finished reorganizing the pamphlet display and came to join them. "You've given us all something to think about," she said thoughtfully. "About strength, about judgment, about what it really means to be a warrior." The morning continued to unfold, the center's peaceful atmosphere fully restored. Veterans began arriving for their regular appointments and support groups, each of them greeting Annie with a new level of respect in their eyes. The story of what had happened would spread through their community, she knew, becoming another thread in the fabric of their shared experience. "You know what, though?" James said, returning to his corner with his fresh coffee. "Those bikers might end up being better for this experience. Sometimes people need to be shown their own limitations before they can grow beyond them." Annie nodded, remembering her own moments of revelation during SEAL training. "Growth often comes from confronting our assumptions," she said quietly. "About ourselves, about others, about what we're capable of. The center settled into its daily routine, the morning's excitement fading into memory. But something had changed, not just in the bikers who had left with their tails between their legs, but in the very atmosphere of the place. The Veterans Center had always been a sanctuary, but now it was something more, a place where real strength had been demonstrated, where assumptions had been challenged, and where transformation had been possible. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the Veterans Center's windows as Annie finished updating the last of the day's records. The morning's confrontation had settled into the building's history, becoming part of its story, just like the countless photographs and medals that adorned its walls. Frank Thompson, who had stayed later than usual, wheeled his chair to Annie's desk one final time. "You know," he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of service, "what happened today? It reminded me of something we used to say in Vietnam. The quietest ones are often the deadliest." Annie looked up from her paperwork, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "In Buddhist, they taught us that true strength isn't about being seen, it's about being effective. Sometimes that means staying in the shadows, and sometimes—" She paused, remembering Snake's face as realization had dawned. "Sometimes it means standing in the light." Rebecca approached, carrying 2 cups of fresh coffee. She handed one to Annie and kept the other for herself. "The word's already spreading," she said, leaning against the desk. "The morning regulars have been telling everyone about the female SEAL who taught some bikers a lesson in respect. Though I notice the story gets more dramatic with each telling." Annie took a sip of her coffee, shaking her head slightly. "That's not what today was about," she said quietly. "It wasn't about showing strength or proving anything. It was about protecting this place, this sanctuary." James Rodriguez, who had decided to stay for the afternoon support group, joined their small gathering. "Maybe," he said thoughtfully, "but you've given a lot of people something to think about. Not just those bikers, but everyone who hears about what happened. About assumptions, about judgment, about what real strength looks like." The center had grown quieter as the day wound down. Through the windows they could see the sun beginning its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The same parking spots where the motorcycles had stood now held ordinary cars belonging to veterans who had come seeking help, understanding, and community. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Rebecca said, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "The look on that young one's face, Tommy, when he realized who you were. It wasn't just fear or respect. It was like watching someone's whole worldview shift in real time." Annie nodded, remembering the transformation she had witnessed. "Sometimes that's what people need," she said. "Not a fight, not a confrontation, but a moment that makes them question everything they thought they knew. That's how real change happens." Frank's weathered hands gripped his wheelchair's armrests. "In all my years," he said, "I've seen all kinds of strength. The kind that wins battles, the kind that survives torture, the kind that carries on when everything seems hopeless. But what you showed today, that quiet, controlled power, that's the kind that changes lives. The centers." Clock ticked steadily on the wall, marking the end of another day of service. Outside, Cedar Ridge was winding down. Shop owners closing up, people heading home, the rhythm of small-town life continuing its eternal cycle. "Think they'll be back?" James asked, voicing the question that had been on everyone's mind. "The steel, Serpents, I mean." Annie considered this for a moment, her tactical mind assessing possibilities as she had done countless times in the field. "If they do," she said finally, "it won't be the same. They might come back to make amends, to prove they've changed, or even to help. But they won't come back looking for trouble. Some lessons stick." Rebecca smiled, raising her coffee cup in a mock toast to lessons learned, she said, and to the quietest ones being the deadliest. The small group shared a knowing laugh, the kind that comes from shared experience and understanding. The morning's tension had transformed into something else a strengthening of bonds, a deepening of respect, a reminder of why they were all there. "You know," Frank said, preparing to wheel himself toward the door, "days like today remind me why this place is so important. It's not just about helping veterans with paperwork or running support groups. It's about maintaining a space where respect isn't demanded, it's earned." Annie stood walking to the window to watch the sunset paint the sky. Her reflection in the glass showed a woman who had fought battles most people couldn't imagine, who had pushed beyond every limit society had tried to place on her, who had earned her place among the elite, not through intimidation, but through unwavering dedication and skill. "Tomorrow's another day," she said quietly, more to herself than the others. "Another chance to serve, to protect, to make a difference." Her hand unconsciously touched the spot where her sealed trident had once rested on her uniform. That's what it's always been about. The center grew quiet as the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky. The day's events would become part of its legend, a reminder that strength comes in many forms, that assumptions are often wrong, and that sometimes the most powerful message is the one delivered without a single blow being struck. One by one, they prepared to leave, each carrying with them a new understanding of what it meant to be truly strong. As Annie locked up the center for the night, she knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to serve. But for now, she had done what she had been trained to do: protect those who needed protection, stand firm in the face of threats, and show that true strength often comes in unexpected packages. If you enjoyed this story about courage, transformation, and challenging assumptions, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications to stay updated with more powerful stories about real strength and unexpected heroes. Remember to share your thoughts in the comments below about what real power means to you. Whether you're a veteran serving now, or just someone who believes in standing up for what's right, your voice matters in this community. Don't forget to like this video and ring that bell to never miss future stories of bravery and redemption. This story wasn't just about a female Navy SEAL teaching some bikers a lesson. It was about how true strength often comes from unexpected places, and how one powerful moment can change lives forever. Join our growing community of storytellers and listeners who believe in the power of these meaningful moments. See you in the next video, where we'll continue to share stories that remind us what real courage looks like.